They laughed when I pulled up in my rusted 15-year-old car to my ex-husband's wedding. My dress was thrifted. My shoes were scuffed. He smirked like I was still that broke woman he left behind. Then my assistant pulled up behind me, in a car that made the whole parking lot go silent. By the end of that day, everyone standing on that lawn would know exactly who I really was. But before I tell you what happened at that wedding, I need you to understand where this story really begins, because the truth is heavier than it looks. If you've ever been made to feel small, invited somewhere just so someone could feel bigger than you, stay with me till the end. This one is for you. And if you haven't already, hit that follow button now because you don't want to miss how this ends. My name is Nia, and I was 22 years old when my marriage was arranged. Not the kind of arrangement built on two families who loved each other and wanted to bring their children together with blessings. This was different. This was a marriage built out of obligation, out of pressure from his parents, out of a decision that was never really mine or his to make freely. His name was James, and from the very first day I met him, I could feel the distance in his eyes, the kind of distance that comes from a man standing next to a life he never chose for himself. I found out much later, though I suspected it from the beginning, that James had loved someone else before his parents pushed him toward me. A woman he wanted to marry, a woman his family didn't approve of at the time for reasons that were never fully explained to me, though I had my guesses. Instead, his parents arranged our marriage, and I became the wife he settled for, not the wife he chose. I want to be honest about those 2 years we spent together because they shaped me in ways I didn't understand until much later. I tried. I tried so hard to make that marriage feel like a real one. I cooked meals he barely touched. I asked about his day and received one-word answers. I lay beside him at night feeling the coldness of a man whose heart was somewhere else entirely. I told myself that love could grow with time, that patience was a virtue, that if I was good enough, kind enough, patient enough, he would eventually see me. He never did, not really. There were moments, brief and rare, where he'd laugh at something I said or hold my hand a little longer than necessary, and I'd cling to those moments like they were proof that things could still change. But underneath all of it, I always felt like a placeholder in his life, a temporary arrangement he was waiting to correct. 2 years into our marriage, I found out the woman he had wanted to marry before me was no longer with the person she'd been involved with. James found out too, faster than I did, and something in him changed almost overnight. He became distant in a new way, colder, more impatient with me, as if my presence had suddenly become an inconvenience standing between him and the life he actually wanted. He asked for a divorce 3 months later. He didn't cry. He didn't struggle with the decision the way people do when they're leaving something that mattered to them. He said it plainly, almost relieved, like a man finally putting down a weight he'd been carrying too long. I remember sitting across from him, feeling something break inside me that I didn't even know was still whole enough to break. The divorce left me with very little, not because the law was cruel, but because I didn't have the strength to fight for more. I walked away with my old car and a small apartment, and a heart that felt like it had been quietly discarded rather than truly loved in the first place. Within a year, James married her, the woman he'd wanted all along, a woman who was praised everywhere for her beauty, her grace, her perfect place beside him in every photo that started appearing online. And then the invitation came, gold lettering, thick cardstock. My name written in elegant handwriting that felt more like an insult than an honor. At first, I couldn't understand why he would invite me at all. It didn't take long to understand the truth. He wasn't inviting me out of courtesy. He was inviting me so that everyone could see the difference between us, side by side in the same room. He wanted his family, his friends, and maybe even himself to see that he had upgraded, that he had finally gotten the life he always wanted, and that I was simply the version of his life he was fortunate enough to leave behind. I want to tell you honestly about the 2 years between that divorce and that wedding invitation, because that's where I truly became who I am today. Those years were not easy. They were not glamorous. There were nights I sat in the dark because I didn't want to spend money on electricity for a life I was barely living. My family loved me, but even they grew tired of watching me struggle, tired of waiting for me to bounce back the way people expect broken things to simply fix themselves with time. I blamed myself in the beginning. I wondered if I hadn't been beautiful enough, patient enough, understanding enough. It took me almost a year to accept that none of this was ever truly about me. It was about a decision that was never mine to make, a marriage that was never truly chosen, and a man who was always looking toward a door I could never open for him. The turning point came quietly, the way most real change does. I found old notes I'd written years earlier, ideas I once had before my life became consumed with trying to hold together something that was never meant to be whole. I took the small savings I had left and I invested it into a business idea I had once dismissed as impractical. It felt reckless. It felt terrifying, But for the first time since the divorce, it felt entirely mine. The beginning was brutal. I worked from a small corner of my apartment, using equipment that barely functioned. I made mistakes. I lost opportunities before I even understood what I was building. There were nights I questioned everything, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life chasing something so uncertain. But slowly, painfully, things began to shift. One client became several. Word spread in ways my limited resources never could have managed alone. Somewhere in that grind, I hired my first employee, a determined young woman who believed in what I was building before I fully believed in it myself. She became far more than an employee to me. She became the person who witnessed my quiet transformation from nothing into something day after day without ever needing recognition for it. I kept my success hidden from James's world entirely, not out of shame but out of protection. I didn't want his family, his new wife, or their circle of friends knowing anything about the life I was quietly building. I let them believe what they already assumed, that I was still the same broken woman from the divorce, still struggling, still driving that same worn-out car. I let their assumptions work in my favor. By the time the wedding invitation arrived, my business had grown into something I could barely have imagined during those dark, uncertain nights, but none of that mattered to the people in James's circle. To them, I was frozen exactly where he'd left me. I debated for weeks whether to attend that wedding at all. Part of me wanted to avoid the humiliation entirely, to spare myself a room full of people who had already decided who I was. But a quieter, steadier part of me knew I needed to walk into that space, not for revenge, but to finally close a chapter I had been carrying with me for far too long. My family had mixed feelings, some encouraging me to attend with quiet dignity, others worried I was walking into unnecessary pain. My assistant, the one who had watched this entire transformation unfold, asked me a single question. She asked if I was going for him or for myself. I sat with that question for a long time before I found my answer. On the morning of the wedding, I stood in front of my closet longer than I care to admit. I could have worn something new, something that reflected the life I now lived. Instead, I chose a simple dress I already owned. I chose my old car, the same one that had carried me through the hardest years of my life. I wasn't trying to make a statement to anyone else. That car and I had survived something together, and I wasn't ready to erase that history just because I finally could. I told myself the entire drive there that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But if I'm honest, some small human part of me was nervous about the expression waiting on his face when he saw me walk in. The venue was stunning in the way only carefully curated wealth can be. Manicured gardens, soft string lights, quiet music drifting through the air. I parked my old car among rows of gleaming vehicles, and I felt every eye that passed by it. I heard the quiet laughter before I even stepped out. I kept my head up anyway. When I walked toward the entrance, I saw him standing near the front, greeting guests with practiced ease, looking every bit the man he always wanted to become. When his eyes landed on me, a familiar smirk spread slowly across his face, the kind that says everything without a single word. Beside him, his new wife glanced my way with an expression that mixed curiosity with quiet satisfaction, as if my presence confirmed something she already believed about herself. Someone nearby made a comment about my car, loud enough for me to hear, quiet enough to remain deniable. I felt my chest tighten, felt old shame creeping back up. For a moment, standing there surrounded by people who had already written my story for me, I almost turned around and left, but something told me to stay just a little longer. Then I heard it. The low, steady hum of an engine that didn't belong in that quiet garden. Heads began turning toward the entrance. I turned too, and my breath caught as I watched my assistant pull up in a sleek, polished car, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because everyone already understands exactly what it represents. People assumed at first that the car belonged to some important guest. James's smirk faltered slightly, curiosity replacing his earlier confidence. My assistant stepped out, dressed sharp and professional, and walked directly toward me, placing a folder into my hands, documents for a meeting scheduled later that week. In that simple gesture, everyone standing nearby understood something they hadn't understood moments before. That car wasn't a guest's car, it was mine. My company's car, driven by my employee for my schedule. I watched realization spread through the crowd like a slow wave. I watched James's expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. His new wife's face paled as she pieced together information that was suddenly impossible to ignore. Someone near the back of the crowd, a business associate of James, said my company's name out loud, almost like a question he couldn't quite believe. And then I watched him connect it, watched his eyes widen as he realized the same company he had been hoping to partner with for an upcoming deal was standing right in front of him in a thrifted dress beside an old car. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The whispers that followed me across that lawn moments earlier had shifted entirely. I could feel it in the air, the way conversations that had been about my rusted car were now quietly, urgently about who I actually was. James approached me, his smirk completely gone, replaced by a stiff, uncertain smile. He tried to make small talk, tried to act as though the last few minutes hadn't just rearranged everything he thought he understood. I let him talk. I let him stumble through his awkward attempt at conversation. And then, quietly, without raising my voice or making a scene, I told him the truth. I told him I hoped he found the life he was always chasing, the one his parents never let him choose freely, the one he eventually took by leaving me behind. I told him I no longer needed his approval or his recognition, and that I hadn't needed it for a long time, even before I had a single client to my name. I told him that the woman standing in front of him had spent 2 years rebuilding herself from nothing, not for this moment, not for revenge, but because she refused to let a marriage she never chose define the rest of her life. I watched something shift in his eyes as I spoke, something that looked almost like regret, though I'll never know for certain what he truly felt in that moment. I didn't wait to find out, I didn't gloat. I simply thanked my assistant for the documents and walked back toward my old car, the same one that had carried me through years he never witnessed, years that quietly built the woman standing in front of him. As I drove away from that venue, I didn't feel triumphant in the dramatic way stories sometimes promise. I felt something quieter, steadier. I felt free. Somewhere on that drive home, I understood that the real transformation was never about the car, the business, or the money. It happened in the silent, unseen years when nobody was watching, when I rebuilt myself decision by decision, long before anyone else knew there was anything left to rebuild. I kept that rusted car for a long time after that day. People who visit my office sometimes ask why a woman in my position still drives something so old. I tell them the truth. That car reminds me of who I was before a marriage I never chose tried to define me. It reminds me that my worth was never about what I drove, what I wore, or what anyone else believed about my life. It reminds me that the years spent in struggle were never wasted. They were the years that built everything I have now. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. Let them smirk, let them underestimate you, let them invite you somewhere just to make themselves feel bigger, because the moment you stop needing their approval is the moment your real life finally begins. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, someone who's been made to feel small by people who don't know their whole story yet. Follow for more stories like this one and drop a comment telling me honestly, would you have shown up in that old car too? I'll see you in the next story.